Celtic Tomes, bringing you readings from bygone books.
Welcome to Celtic Tomes, bringing you readings by Gary and Ruth from the classic books of Celtic lore and study. Chapter 12 of The Religion of the Ancient Celts by J.A. MacCulloch.
Chapter 11. Primitive Nature Worship. In early thought, everything was a person, in the loose meaning then possessed by personality, and many such persons were worshipped: earth, sun, moon, sea, wind, etc. This led later to more complete personification, and the sun, or earth divinity, or spirit, was more or less separated from the sun or earth themselves. Some Celtic divinities were thus evolved, but there still continued a veneration of the objects of nature in themselves, as well as of cult of nature spirits or secondary divinities who peopled every part of nature. "Nor will I call out upon the mountains, fountains, or hills, or upon the rivers which are now subservient to the use of man, but once were an abomination and a destruction to them, and to which the blind people paid divine honours," cries Gildas. This was the true cult of the folk, the blind people, even when the greater gods were organised, and it has survived with modifications in out-of-the-way places, in spite of the coming of Christianity. St. Kentigern rebuked the Cambrians for worshipping the elements, which God made for man's use. The question of the daughters of Loegaire also throws much light on Celtic nature worship. "Has your God sons or daughters? Have many fostered his sons? Are his daughters dear and beautiful to men? Is he in heaven or on earth, in the sea, in the rivers, in the mountains, in the valleys?" The words suggest a belief in divine beings filling heaven, earth, sea, air, hills, glens, lochs and rivers, and following human customs. A naive faith, full of beauty and poetry, even if it had its dark and grim aspects. These powers or personalities had been invoked from time immemorial, but the invocations were soon stereotyped into definite formulae. Such a formula is put into the Mount of Morgen, the poet of the Milesians, when they are about to invade Erin, and it may have been a magical invocation of the powers of nature at the beginning or of an undertaking, or in times of danger. "I invoke the land of Ireland, shining, shining sea, fertile, fertile mountain, wooded vale, abundant river, abundant in waters, fish abounding lake, fish abounding sea, fertile earth, eruption of fish, fish there, bird under wave, great fish, crab hole, eruption of fish, fish abounding sea." A similar formula was spoken after the destruction of Derga's Hostel by MacCecht on his finding water. He bathed in it and sang, "Cold fountain, surface of strand, sea of lake, water of Gara, stream of river, high spring well, cold fountain." The goddess Morrigan, after the defeat of the Fomorians, invokes the powers of nature and proclaims the victory to "the royal mountains of Ireland, to its chief waters and its river mouths." It was also customary to take oaths by the elements: heaven, earth, sun, fire, moon, sea, land, day, night, etc., and these punished the breaker of the oath. Even the gods exacted such an oath of each other. Bres swore by the sun, moon, sea and land to fulfil the engagement imposed on him by Lu. The formulae survived into Christian times, and the faithful were forbidden to call the sun and the moon gods or to swear by them. While in Breton folk custom at the present day, oaths by sun, moon or earth, followed by punishment of the oath-breaker by the moon, are still in use. These oaths had originated in a time when the elements themselves were thought to be divine, and similar adjurations were used by the Greeks and the Scandinavians. While the greater objects of nature were worshipped for themselves alone, the Celts also peopled the earth with spirits, benevolent or malevolent, of rocks, hills, dales, forests, lakes and streams. And while greater divinities of growth had been evolved, they still believed in lesser spirits of vegetation, of the corn, and of fertility, connected, however, with these gods. Some of these still survive as fairies seen in meadows, woodlands, or streams, or as demoniac beings haunting lonely places. And even now, in French folk belief, sun, moon, winds, etc. are regarded as actual personages. Sun and moon are husband and wife. The winds have wives. They are addressed by personal names and reverenced. Some spirits may already have had a demoniac aspect in pagan times. The Tuirbe conjured up meisi, spectral bodies that rise from the ground, against the Milesians, and at their service were malignant sprites, urtrochta, and forms, spectres and great queens, called the guidemain, false demons. The Druids also sent forth mischievous spirits called siabra. In the Táin there are references to bocânachs, banánaichs, and geniti-glinni, goblins, eldritch beings, and glen folk. These are twice called Tuirbe, and this suggests that they were nature spirits akin to the greater gods. The geniti-glinni would be spirits haunting glen and valley. They're friendly to Jullian in the Táin, but in the feast of Bricriu, he and the other heroes fight and destroy them. In modern Irish belief, they are demons of the air, perhaps fallen angels. Much of this is probably pre-Celtic as well as Celtic, but it held its ground because it was dear to the Celts themselves. They upheld the original cults resembling those which in the lands from whence they came had been native and local with themselves. Such cults are as old as the world, and when Christianity expelled the worship of the greater gods, younger in growth, the ancient nature worship, dowered with immortal youth, bowed low before the blast in patient deep disdain, to rise again in vigour. Preachers, councils and laws invade against it. The old rites continue to be practised, or survived under a Christian dress and colouring. They are found in Breton villages, in Highland glens, in Welsh and Cornish valleys, in Irish townships, and only the spread of schoolboard education with its materialism and uninviting common sense is forcing them at last to yield. The denunciations of these cults throw some light upon them. Offerings at trees, stones, fountains and crossroads, the lighting of fires or candles there, and vows or incantations addressed to them are forbidden, as is also the worship of trees, groves, stones, rivers and wells. The sun and moon are not to be called lords. Wizardry and divination and the leapings and dancings, songs and choruses of the pagans, i.e. their orgiastic cults, are not to be practised. Tempest raisers are not to ply their diabolical craft. These denunciations, of course, were not without their effect, and legend told how the spirits of nature were heard bewailing the power of the Christian saints, their mournful cries echoing in wooded hollows, secluded valleys, and shores of lake and river. Their power, although limited, was not annihilated, but the secrecy in which the old cults often continued to be practised gave them a darker colour. They were identified with the works of the devil, and the spirits of paganism with dark and grisly demons. This culminated in the medieval witch persecutions, for witchcraft was in part the old paganism in a new guise. Yet even that did not annihilate superstition, which still lives and flourishes among the folk, although the actual worship of nature spirits has now disappeared. Perhaps the most important object in nature to the early Celts, as to most primitive folk, was the moon. The phases of the moon were apparent before men observed the solstices and equinoxes, and they formed an easy method of measuring time. The Celtic year was at first lunar. Pliny speaks of the Celtic method of counting the beginning of months and years by the moon, and night was supposed to precede day. The festivals of growth began not at sunrise, but on the previous evening with the rising of the moon, and the name, La Lunarde, is still given to the midsummer festival in parts of France. At Valois de la Suille, a wood on the slope where the festival is held is called Bois de la Lune. And in Ireland, where the festival begins on the previous evening, in the district where an ascent of Knockaghonia is made, the position of the moon must be observed. A similar combination of sun and moon cults is found in the inscription at Lausanne, to the genius of the sun and moon. Possibly sun festivals took the place of those of the moon. Traces of the connection of the moon with agriculture occur in different regions, the connection being established through the primitive law of sympathetic magic, The moon waxes and wanes, and therefore it must affect all processes of growth or decay. Dr. Fraser has cited many instances of this belief and has shown that the moon had a priority to the sun in worship, e.g. in Egypt and Babylon. Sowing is done with a waxing moon, so that through sympathy there may be a large increase. But harvesting, cutting timber, etc., should be done with a waning moon. Because moisture being caused by a waxing moon, it was necessary to avoid cutting such things, as would spoil by moisture at that time. Similar beliefs are found among the Celts. Mistletoe and other magical plants were culled with a waxing moon, probably because their power would thus be greater. Dr. Johnson noted the fact that the Highlanders sowed their seed with a waxing moon, in the expectation of a better harvest. For similar occult reasons, it is thought in Brittany that conception during a waxing moon produces a male child, during a waning moon a female, while accouchements at the latter time are dangerous. Sheep and cows should be killed at the new moon, else their flesh will shrink, but peats should be cut in the last quarter, otherwise they will remain moist and give out a power of smoke. These ideas take us back to a time when it was held that the moon was not merely a measurer of time, but had powerful effects on the processes of growth and decay. Artemis and Diana, moon goddesses, had power over all growing things, and as some Celtic goddesses were equated with Diana, they may have been connected with the moon, more especially as Gallo-Roman images of Diana have the head adorned with a crescent moon. In some cases, festivals of the moon remained intact, as among the Celt-Iberians and other peoples to the north of them, who at the time of the full moon celebrated the festival of a nameless god, dancing all night before the doors of their houses. The nameless god may have been the moon, worshipped at the time of her intensest light. Moonlight dances round a great stone, with singing on the first day of the year, occurred in the Highlands in the 18th century. Other survivals of cult are seen in the practices of bowing or baring the head at the new moon, or addressing it with words of adoration or supplication. In Ireland, Camden found the custom of new moon of saying the Lord's Prayer with the addition of the words, "Leave us whole and sound as thou hast found us." Similar customs exist in Brittany, where girls pray to the moon to grant them dreams of their future husbands. Like other races, the Celts thought that eclipses were caused by a monster attacking the moon, while it could be driven off with cries and shouts. In 218 BC, the Celtic allies of Attalus were frightened by an eclipse, and much later Christian legislation forbade the people to assemble at an eclipse and shout, "Vince Luna." Such a practice was observed in Ireland in the 17th century. At an earlier time, Irish poets addressed the sun and moon as divinities, and they were represented on altars even at Christian times. While the Celts believed in sea gods, Manannan, Morgen, Jullian, the sea itself was still personified and regarded as divine. It was thought to be a hostile being, and high tides were met by Celtic warriors who advanced against them with sword and spear, often perishing in the rushing waters rather than retreat. The ancients regarded this as bravado. Monsieur Jullian sees in it a sacrifice by voluntary suicide. Monsieur Darbois, a tranquil waiting for death and the introduction to another life. But the passage gives the sense of an actual attack on the waves, living things which men might terrify, and perhaps with this was combined the belief that no one could die during a rising tide. Similarly, French fishermen threatened to cut a fog in two with a knife, while the legend of Saint Loegaire tells how he threw a knife at a fog, thus causing its disappearance. Fighting the waves is also referred to in Irish texts. Thus, Tuirbe Trágmar would hurl a cast of his axe in the face of the flood tide so that he forbade the sea, which then would not come over the axe. Jullian, in one of his fits of anger, fought the waves for 7 days, and Finn fought and conquered the urtrochta, a personification of the wild western sea. On the French coast, fishermen threw harpoons at certain harmful waves called the Three Witch Waves, thus drawing their blood and causing them to subside. In some cases, human victims may have been offered to the rising waters, since certain tales speak of a child set floating on the waves, and this, repeated every 7 years, kept them in their place. The sea had also its beneficent aspects. The shore was a place of revelation of science, and the sea sympathised with human griefs. At the Battle of Ventry,
The sea chattered, telling the losses, and the waves raised a heavy, woeful, great moan in wailing them. In other cases by Ireland, by a spell put on the waves, or by an intuitive knowledge of the listener, it was revealed that they were wailing for death or describing some distant event. In a beautiful song sung by the wife of Kyle, the wave wails against the shore for his death. And in Welsh myth, the waves bewailed the death of Dullan, son of the wave, and were eager to avenge it. The noise of the waves rushing into the Vale of Conwy were his dying groans. In Ireland, the roaring of the sea was thought to be prophetic of a king's death, or the coming of important news, and there too certain great waves were celebrated in story, Clunas, Tuathas, and Ruris. 9 waves, or the 9th wave, partly because of the sacred nature of the number 9, partly because of the beneficent character of the waves, had a great importance. They formed a barrier against invasion, danger or pestilence, or they had a healing effect. The wind was also regarded as a living being whose power was to be dreaded. It punished King Loegaire for breaking his oath, but it was also personified as a god, Vintius, equated with Pollux, and worshipped by Celtic sailors, or with Mars, the war god, who in his destructive aspect was perhaps regarded as the nearest analogue to a god of stormy winds. Druids and Celtic priestesses claimed the power of controlling the winds, as did wizards and witches in later days. This they did, according to Christian writers, by the aid of demons, perhaps the old divinities of the air. Bishop Agabard describes how the Tempestari raised tempests, which destroyed the fruits of the earth, and drew aerial ships from Magonia, whither the ships carried these fruits. Magonia may be the upper air ruled over by a sky god, Magunos or Mogunas, equated with Apollo. The winds may have been his servants, ruled also by earthly magicians. Like Yahweh, as conceived by the Hebrew poets, he bringeth the winds out of his treasures, and maketh lightnings with rain.
And that was Chapter 12 of For the Religion of the Ancient Celts by J.A. MacCulloch. A link to the full text can be found in the show notes.
We'd like to say a massive thank you and give a shout out to Daniel, Selene, Erica, Kyle and Brandy for being patrons of the podcast on our Patreon page. Thank you so much. Your support is ensuring that we can keep on making these shows. If you'd like to support our continued work on Celtic Tomes, please come and find us on patreon.com/Celtic Tomes. That's patreon.com/Celtic Tomes.
You've been listening to Celtic Tomes, read by Gary and Ruth. Our theme music is Gander in the Pratie Hole by Slauncher, and a link to their music can be found in the show notes at celtictomes.libsyn.com. This podcast has been produced by the Celtic Myth Show.